A self-entitled woman boards a crowded flight and immediately starts criticizing a retired veteran for his old military jacket, mocking his service and claiming he's just wearing it for attention. But when he calmly mentions he's traveling to meet someone extraordinary, she laughs it off as another veteran's sob story. Little does she know, the truth she's about to discover will shake her entire worldview and change her life forever. Patricia Morgan drummed her perfectly manicured nails against her leather handbag as she made her way down the narrow airplane aisle. The flight to Boston was packed, and her frustration grew with each step. She'd had a horrible morning. Her favorite coffee shop had messed up her order, her Uber driver had taken a wrong turn, and now she was one of the last people to board. When she finally reached row 23, she spotted her seat, the middle one, of course. Just perfect. On the aisle seat sat a middle-aged man wearing a worn military jacket with various patches and pins. His silver hair was neatly trimmed in a military style, and a weathered duffel bag sat at his feet. The sight of the jacket made Patricia roll her eyes. These days, it seemed like everyone was trying to get attention by flaunting their military connection. "Excuse me," she said sharply, her voice carrying that distinctive tone that had earned women like her a certain notorious nickname on social media. The man looked up, his eyes tired but alert, and carefully moved his legs to let her through. As Patricia squeezed past him, she couldn't help but notice the slight tremor in his hand as he steadied himself on the armrest. Probably another one of those veterans who can't stop living in the past, she thought to herself, settling into her seat with an exaggerated sigh. Patricia adjusted her designer blouse and pulled out her phone, making a show of checking her emails while secretly observing the veteran next to her through her peripheral vision. His jacket looked like it had seen better days, with faded patches that she could barely make out. Something about Vietnam and a unit number she didn't care to understand. The whole thing seemed unnecessarily showy to her, like he was begging for attention or a free upgrade. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their departure, and Patricia noticed how the veteran flinched slightly at the sudden noise. She fought the urge to roll her eyes again. It seemed like every other person these days claimed to be a veteran with PTSD or some other condition, always expecting special treatment. As other passengers continued boarding, a young mother with a baby stopped near their row, struggling with her carry-on bag. The veteran immediately stood up, despite his obvious difficulty, and helped her store the bag in the overhead compartment. Several nearby passengers smiled warmly at him, and someone even thanked him for his service. Patricia felt her irritation spike. It was just a bag, for heaven's sake, not some heroic act of valor. "Must be nice," she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for him to hear as he settled back into his seat. Getting praised for every little thing just because of an old jacket. The veteran turned slightly toward her, his weathered face remaining remarkably composed. His name tag read, Thomas Henderson, though the letters were slightly faded. Patricia noticed a small tremor in his right hand as he adjusted his seatbelt, which only reinforced her prejudices about veterans always playing up their conditions for attention. The plane began its taxi to the runway, and Patricia couldn't help but notice how Thomas kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, his fingers gripping the armrest slightly tighter than necessary. The sight only fueled her preconceptions about veterans who couldn't move on from their past experiences. A flight attendant passed by, offering Thomas a warm smile and asking if he needed anything. Patricia watched as he politely declined, and her frustration grew. She'd been flying this airline for years, but no one ever offered her special treatment. It was always the ones in uniform, or in this case, an ancient military jacket, who got all the attention. As the plane took off, Patricia pulled out her tablet, attempting to distract herself with work documents. But the presence of the veteran next to her kept drawing her attention. She noticed how he pulled out a worn photograph from his jacket pocket, studying it with an intensity that seemed unnecessary. Probably another veteran showing off his war memories, she thought. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as they reached cruising altitude, and Patricia found herself growing increasingly annoyed by Thomas's presence. When he made every slight adjustment of his jacket, felt like a deliberate attempt to draw attention to his veteran status. She'd seen plenty of these types before, always ready with a war story, always expecting everyone to bow down to their service. "You know," she said, unable to contain herself any longer, "there are more ways to serve society than just wearing an old military jacket. Some of us work hard every day without needing to advertise it." Thomas turned to her again, his expression remaining surprisingly gentle despite her obvious hostility. There was something in his eyes that Patricia couldn't quite read. Not anger or defensiveness, but something deeper, more complex. For a brief moment she felt a flicker of uncertainty about her assumptions, but she quickly pushed it aside. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing several passengers to gasp. Patricia noticed how Thomas's hand tightened on the armrest, his knuckles turning white. She was about to make another snide comment about veterans and their dramatic reactions when she caught sight of the photograph he'd been holding earlier. It had slipped slightly out of his pocket, revealing what looked like a group of young men in military uniforms, their faces bright with youth and hope. Something about the image made her pause, but her pride wouldn't let her show any sign of softening. Instead, she turned back to her tablet, trying to focus on her work while secretly watching Thomas from the corner of her eye. There was something about him that didn't quite fit her preconceived notions of attention-seeking veterans, but she wasn't ready to admit that yet. The flight had barely begun, and Patricia Morgan had no idea that her carefully constructed worldview was about to be challenged in ways she never expected. The next hour of the flight passed in tense silence, broken only by the quiet hum of the engines and occasional announcements from the cockpit. Patricia kept stealing glances at Thomas, her mind building up a narrative about him that fit her prejudices. She had encountered many veterans before in her role as a senior executive at a large corporation, and in her mind, they all fell into the same category. People who couldn't stop living in the past, always expecting special treatment for their service. She watched as Thomas carefully folded the photograph and tucked it back into his jacket pocket. His movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, which only served to irritate her further. In her world of corporate efficiency and modern thinking, such sentimentality seemed outdated and unnecessary. "Do you always wear that jacket when you travel?" Patricia asked, her voice dripping with barely concealed disdain. "It must be convenient, getting all that special attention." Thomas turned to her slowly, his expression remaining remarkably composed. "I wear it when I need to," he replied quietly, his voice carrying a gentle dignity that somehow made Patricia even more annoyed. "When you need to?" she scoffed. "You mean when you need people to treat you like some kind of hero? I see right through that." She adjusted her designer watch, a subtle reminder of her own success. "I've worked with plenty of veterans at my company, always expecting preferential treatment, always talking about their service like it makes them better than everyone else." A flight attendant passed by their row, offering Thomas another smile and asking if he needed anything. Patricia's blood pressure rose as she watched the interaction. She'd been on this same flight route dozens of times, but no one ever showed her such consideration. "You see?" she said after the flight attendant left. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. Special treatment just because of an old jacket. Some of us have worked hard our whole lives without needing to advertise it." Thomas remained silent, his hands folded neatly in his lap. The tremor in his right hand was more noticeable now, but he made no attempt to hide it. This only fueled Patricia's assumptions about veterans who, in her mind, played up their conditions for sympathy. "I mean, honestly," she continued, emboldened by his silence, "it's been decades since Vietnam. Don't you think it's time to move on? The rest of us have real challenges to deal with in the present." A few passengers nearby turned to look at them, their expressions a mix of shock and disapproval. Patricia noticed, but didn't care. In her mind, she was simply saying what everyone else was thinking, but was too afraid to say. "You don't know anything about moving on," Thomas said finally, his voice still calm, but carrying a weight that Patricia chose to ignore. "Or about what any of us carry." "Oh, please," Patricia rolled her eyes. "I'm so tired of that narrative. My father was in business during the recession of 2008. He lost everything and had to rebuild from scratch. That's real sacrifice. That's real struggle. And narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. See him wearing his old business suits around, expecting people to thank him for his service to the economy. She pulled out her tablet again, tapping aggressively at the screen. And now we have all these young veterans too, coming back from these modern wars, acting like there's something special. At least your generation saw real combat. These kids today, with all their technology and drones, they probably spent most of their time in air-conditioned rooms. Thomas's expression flickered for just a moment, a brief shadow passing across his face. But Patricia was too caught up in her own narrative to notice. She had spent years building up these prejudices, reinforcing them with carefully selected examples that confirmed her worldview. "You want to know what real stress is?" she continued, her voice rising slightly. "Try managing a team of 50 people during a global pandemic. Try meeting quarterly targets when the whole world is shutting down. That's real pressure, that's real responsibility. But I don't go around wearing a badge saying COVID survivor or expecting people to praise me for keeping my company afloat." The irony of her own need to broadcast her achievements was lost on Patricia as she launched into another critique of what she saw as veteran privilege. Each word she spoke revealed more about her own insecurities than any truth about the man sitting quietly beside her. Thomas shifted slightly in his seat, and Patricia noticed a small wooden bead bracelet on his wrist, partially hidden under his jacket sleeve. It looked handmade, the kind of thing you might find at a craft fair or veterans support group. This small detail provided her with more ammunition. "And all these support groups and special programs," she continued, gesturing vaguely at his bracelet. "Everyone's so focused on helping veterans, but what about the rest of us? What about the people who keep this country running day after day? I've had employees, veterans, mind you, who expected time off for every little thing. PTSD this, anxiety that. Meanwhile, I worked through a severe case of pneumonia last year because that's what responsible people do." The plane hit another patch of turbulence, and Patricia noticed how Thomas's hand tightened on the armrest again. She couldn't resist commenting, "See? That's exactly what I mean. Everything's so dramatic with veterans. A little turbulence and suddenly it's like you're back in a combat zone or something." A young man across the aisle shot her a disapproving look, but Patricia was beyond caring about other people's opinions. In her mind, she was taking a brave stand against what she saw as society's excessive coddling of veterans. "You know what my grandmother used to say?" she continued, warming to her theme. "She said that her generation just got on with things after the war. No therapy, no support groups, no special treatment. They just picked themselves up and moved forward. But now, everyone wants a parade just for doing their job." Thomas remained silent, his eyes focused straight ahead. His composure only served to irritate Patricia further. In her experience, people who remained quiet during confrontation were either hiding something or trying to make others feel guilty. Either way, she wasn't going to fall for it. "I bet you're one of those veterans who goes to all the memorials, aren't you?" she pressed on. "Always dwelling on the past instead of focusing on the present. I see them in Washington all the time, with their ceremonies and their reunions. Don't you think it's time to let go? To join the rest of us in the real world?" The cruelty of her words hung in the air, but Patricia felt no remorse. In her mind, she was simply speaking truth to what she saw as an outdated and overindulged portion of society. She had no idea that her next discovery would shatter every preconception she held, forcing her to confront the true cost of her prejudice. Patricia's comments hung in the air like a heavy cloud, but Thomas's continued silence only fueled her growing irritation. She watched as he carefully adjusted his jacket, her eyes fixing on a particular metal pinned to the fabric. The sight of it sparked another wave of resentment. "Is that why you wear all those medals? For the attention?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to make a nearby passenger glance over. I mean, I understand keeping them at home, but wearing them in public seems a bit theatrical, don't you think? Thomas finally turned to face her, his weathered features showing no sign of anger despite her provocations. "This medal isn't for attention, ma'am," he said quietly. "It has a different meaning altogether." "Oh, I'm sure it does," Patricia replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Everything has some deep, profound meaning with veterans, doesn't it? Every pin, every patch, every story has to be some grand testament to sacrifice and heroism." His hand moved to touch the medal briefly, almost unconsciously, and it only reinforced her prejudices. "You know what real sacrifice looks like in today's world? Try missing your child's piano recital because you're closing $1 million deal. Try working 60-hour weeks to keep a company afloat during a recession. That's sacrifice." A flight attendant approached their row, perhaps sensing the tension. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her eyes moving between Patricia and Thomas. "Everything's fine," Patricia snapped. "I'm just having a discussion with our resident hero here about what real sacrifice means in the modern world." The flight attendant's expression hardened slightly, but Thomas spoke before she could respond. "We're fine, thank you," he said calmly. "Just a difference of opinion." After the flight attendant left, Patricia couldn't help but notice how several nearby passengers were now openly watching their interaction. She felt a surge of defiance. Let them watch, she thought. Someone needed to say these things out loud. "You see?" she continued, gesturing at the retreating flight attendant. "Everyone's so quick to jump to your defense. Heaven forbid someone questions the sacred status of veterans. It's like some kind of cultural brainwashing." Thomas remained quiet for a moment, then spoke with measured words. "Not everything is about defense or attack, ma'am. Sometimes people just try to help other people." "Help?" Patricia scoffed. "Is that what you call it? Special treatment is more like it. I saw how they offered you pre-boarding, how they keep checking on you. Meanwhile, hard-working people like me who actually contribute to society today, not decades ago, have to wait in line like everyone else." She watched as Thomas reached into his jacket pocket again, pulling out what looked like a small notebook. The motion revealed another patch on his jacket, this one faded almost beyond recognition. "And what's that supposed to be?" she asked, pointing at the patch. "Another reminder of your glory days? Another conversation starter so people can thank you for your service?" Thomas looked down at the patch, his expression softening slightly. "This patch. It's from my unit. We served together in '69. "Of course it is." Patricia rolled her eyes. "Everything's a memorial with you people. Everything's a reminder, a symbol, a sacred relic. Don't you think it's time to create some new memories? To accomplish something in the present instead of living in the past?" The plane hit another bout of turbulence, and Patricia noticed how Thomas's grip tightened on his notebook. She was about to make another comment about dramatic reactions when she caught a glimpse of what looked like a medical document peeking out from the notebook's pages. "Oh, let me guess," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Medical papers? More evidence of your suffering? Another reason why society should bow down and accommodate your every need." Thomas carefully tucked the document back into his notebook, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Not everything is what it seems, ma'am," he said quietly. "Sometimes papers tell stories we'd rather not share." His cryptic response only irritated Patricia further. In her mind, it was just another example of veterans being unnecessarily mysterious, playing up their experiences for sympathy and attention. She had no idea that those papers would soon force her to confront the true cost of her prejudice, revealing a truth that would shake her carefully constructed worldview to its core. The tension between Patricia and Thomas continued to escalate as the flight progressed. She watched with growing irritation as he carefully placed his notebook back in his jacket pocket, her mind already forming judgments about what those medical papers might contain. "You know what's funny?" she said, unable to contain herself. "In my company, we have this veterans hiring program. Mandatory diversity initiative, you understand. And every single one of them expects special accommodations, special schedules for therapy, special understanding for their triggers, special everything. Thomas listened quietly, his hands folded in his lap. The tremor in his right hand was more noticeable now, but he made no attempt to hide it or explain it away. This only fueled Patricia's assumptions. See that? She gestured toward his trembling hand. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Everything becomes a symptom, a condition, a reason for special treatment. Back in my day, people just dealt with their problems privately. A flight attendant passed by with the beverage cart, offering Thomas a drink first. Patricia's blood pressure rose as she watched him politely decline. "Water, please," she said sharply when the attendant finally turned to her. "And maybe next time you could serve paying customers first instead of playing favorites." The attendant's professional smile tightened, but before she could respond, Thomas spoke up. "Ma'am, please don't take your frustrations out on her. She's just doing her job." "Oh, so now you're defending her?" Patricia's voice rose slightly. "How noble of you. Always the hero, aren't you? Always standing up for others while playing the victim yourself." Several passengers nearby were now openly staring at them. Patricia could hear whispers of disapproval, but it only strengthened her resolve. In her mind, she was taking a stand against what she saw as society's excessive coddling of veterans. "You want to know what real stress is?" she continued, her voice carrying across several rows. "Try managing a global team across 5 time zones. Try making decisions that affect thousands of people's livelihoods. But I don't go around wearing a uniform or expecting special treatment." Thomas reached for his water bottle with his trembling hand, and Patricia noticed a faded tattoo on his wrist. Something military, no doubt. "Let me guess," she said, gesturing toward it. "Another war story? Another tale of heroism and sacrifice?" "No, ma'am," Thomas replied quietly. "Just a reminder of promises made." "Promises," Patricia scoffed. "Everything's so dramatic with you veterans. Everything has to have some deep, profound meaning. What about the promises regular people make? What about the sacrifices we make every day?" She pulled out her phone, checking her emails aggressively. "You know what? I missed my daughter's graduation because I was closing a crucial deal in Tokyo. That's real sacrifice. But you don't see me wearing it like a badge of honor." Thomas's expression shifted slightly at the mention of graduation, something flickering in his eyes that Patricia either didn't notice or chose to ignore. Instead, she continued her tirade. "And these young veterans nowadays coming back from their wars with their fancy technology and their support systems, they have no idea what real hardship is. At least your generation," she gestured dismissively at Tomasao, "saw actual combat. These kids probably spent most of their time playing with computers." The old veteran's hands tightened slightly on his armrests, but his voice remained steady. "Every generation faces its own battles, ma'am. The uniform might change, but the sacrifice remains the same." "Oh, spare me the fortune cookie wisdom," Patricia snapped. "I've heard enough of these rehearsed lines. Next, you'll be telling me about brotherhood and honor and all those other romantic notions that have nothing to do with the real world." She noticed Thomas glancing at his watch, his movements careful and measured. "Got somewhere important to be?" she asked sarcastically. "Another veterans parade? Another ceremony where everyone has to stand and applaud?" The cruelty of her words hung in the air, but Patricia felt no remorse. In her mind, she was simply speaking truth to what she saw as an outdated and overindulged portion of society. She had no idea that her next discovery would force her to confront the true cost of her prejudice, revealing a reality that would shatter her carefully constructed worldview. "You haven't answered my question," Patricia pressed, her voice carrying an edge that made nearby passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Where are you headed that's so important you need to keep checking your watch? Another one of those veteran reunions where you all sit around telling war stories?" Thomas took a slow, measured breath before responding. Sometimes, ma'am, the most important journeys aren't about where we're going, but who we're going to see. Oh, please, Patricia rolled her eyes dramatically. There you go again with the cryptic responses. Why can't you veterans ever give a straight answer? It's always metaphors and hidden meanings with you people. A baby started crying a few rows ahead, and Patricia noticed how Thomas's hands tightened slightly on the armrests. The reaction sparked another wave of criticism from her. Let me guess. The crying triggers your PTSD. Another reason why society needs to walk on eggshells around veterans? Not everything is about trauma, ma'am, Thomas replied quietly, his eyes focused straight ahead. Sometimes a cry is just a cry. Patricia let out a sharp laugh that drew more disapproving glances from nearby passengers. Right. That's why your generation has turned trauma into an industry. Support groups, special programs, priority treatment. It's like a never-ending cycle of victimhood. She pulled out her tablet again, tapping aggressively at the screen. You know what real trauma is? Try laying off 100 people during a pandemic. Try telling families their breadwinner no longer has a job, but you don't see me wearing it like a uniform. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out what looked like a worn photograph, caught a glimpse of young men in uniform before he quickly tucked it away again. More memories? She sneered. More ghosts from the past? Sometimes memories are all we have left, Thomas said softly, his voice carrying a weight that Patricia deliberately chose to ignore. That's your problem right there, she declared, gesturing wildly. Always living in the past, always dwelling on what happened decades ago. The world has moved on, you know. We have real problems to deal with now. A flight attendant approached their row again, perhaps drawn by Patricia's increasingly loud voice. Can I get you anything? She asked, her question clearly directed at Thomas. No, thank you, Thomas replied politely, but Patricia wasn't done. Oh, of course, she interjected. Check on the veteran first. Never mind the rest of us paying customers. He might need special attention for his special conditions. The flight attendant's professional demeanor cracked slightly. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. You're disturbing other passengers. Of course I am, Patricia shot back. Heaven forbid someone speaks the truth about our precious veterans. Everyone's so worried about their feelings, their comfort, their special needs. What about the rest of us? Thomas remained silent throughout this exchange, his composure only serving to irritate Patricia further. She watched as he pulled out his notebook again, his trembling hands carefully opening it to a specific page. More medical papers? She asked mockingly. More proof of your suffering? You veterans really know how to milk the system, don't you? The old veteran's expression remained unchanged, but something in his eyes shifted. He looked at Patricia with what seemed like genuine concern, which only fueled her anger. She didn't need pity, especially not from someone she saw as constantly seeking it themselves. Don't look at me like that, she snapped. I don't need your sympathy. I'm not the one wearing my problems like a uniform, expecting the world to bow down and accommodate my every need. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, and Patricia noticed how Thomas's hand moved instinctively to his chest, where she could now see the outline of what appeared to be a medal beneath his jacket. Another medal? She scoffed. How many do you need? Isn't wearing the jacket enough of a cry for attention? Thomas's response was unexpected in its simplicity. This one isn't mine, he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the plane's engine noise. The statement hung in the air between them, carrying a weight that Patricia wasn't yet ready to understand. Not yours? Patricia's eyebrows raised in mock interest. Let me guess, another fallen comrade? Another tragic story you used to get sympathy from strangers? She watched as Thomas's hand moved to touch the metal through his jacket, the gesture seeming almost unconscious. The tremor in his hand was more pronounced now, but Patricia interpreted it as just another bid for attention. You veterans are all the same, she continued, her voice rising again. Everything has to be a symbol, a memorial, a tribute. Can't just wear a regular jacket like normal people. Can't just live in the present like the rest of us. A middle-aged man across the aisle cleared his throat loudly, shooting Patricia a disapproving look. She turned to face him, her anger finding a new target. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said sarcastically. "Am I not being reverent enough? Should I bow down and thank him for his service every 5 minutes?" Thomas spoke again, his voice still maintaining that maddening calm. "The medal belonged to someone very special," he said. "Someone I'm going to see today." "Of course it did." Patricia rolled her eyes. "Another convenient story. You people always have some dramatic tale ready to go, don't you? Always prepared to play the hero card or the tragedy card, whatever gets you more attention." She noticed Thomas checking his watch again, and it sparked another wave of irritation. "What's the matter? Worried you'll be late for your big, emotional reunion? Your dramatic moment of tears and hugs while everyone stands around applauding?" The flight attendant returned, this time with a more serious expression. "Ma'am, this is your final warning about disturbing other passengers. If you continue, we'll have to take further action." Patricia let out a sharp laugh. "Further action? Because I'm speaking my mind? Because I'm not buying into this whole veteran worship culture? This is exactly what I'm talking about. Everyone rushing to protect their feelings while ignoring reality." Thomas remained silent through this exchange, his hands folded neatly in his lap despite their trembling. The calm dignity of his posture only served to irritate Patricia more. In her mind, it was all an act, a carefully crafted performance designed to make her look like the villain. Mouth to respond, but for the first time since boarding the plane, no sharp comments came to her lips. Thomas carefully tucked the photograph back into his notebook, his hands still trembling but his movements deliberate and respectful. The metal under his jacket seemed to carry a different weight now, one that Patricia was just beginning to understand. The realization of what Thomas was really saying, of where he was really going and why, was starting to seep through the cracks of Patricia's prejudice, but she wasn't ready to acknowledge it yet. She turned away, her face flushed, trying to hold on to her anger and judgment even as they began to crumble in the face of this unexpected truth. The revelation about Thomas's son hung in the air like a heavy cloud, but Patricia wasn't ready to let go of her prejudices just yet. She sat rigidly in her seat, her mind racing to maintain her previous convictions, even as they began to crack around the edges. "A Marine," she finally said, her voice slightly less confident than before. "And I suppose he was some kind of hero too? Another perfect soldier for everyone to admire?" Thomas's hands moved carefully over his notebook, his fingers tracing the edges with a gentleness that seemed at odds with Patricia's harsh tone. "My son wasn't perfect, ma'am," he said quietly. "None of us are. He was just a young man who believed in something bigger than himself." "Bigger than himself," Patricia repeated mockingly, but her voice lacked its earlier venom. "That's what they all say. That's how they justify all the special treatment, all the attention-seeking." She watched as Thomas pulled out another photograph, this one showing a young Marine in dress uniform, his smile bright and confident. Despite herself, Patricia noticed how the young man's eyes seemed to carry the same quiet dignity as his father's. "Ryan was 26, Thomas said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "He loved baseball, played second base in high school, wanted to be a teacher after his service was done. Had it all planned out." "Had it all planned out," Patricia echoed. But something in her tone had shifted. There was a question there now, hiding beneath her skepticism. "And let me guess, he made some noble sacrifice? Another tragic hero story?" Thomas's hand moved to the metal again, and this time Patricia found herself watching the gesture with different eyes. "He was leading a convoy," Thomas continued, his voice growing softer. "There was a school nearby. When they spotted the IED, he had a choice to make." Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She didn't want to hear this part, didn't want to know what choice Ryan had made, but she couldn't stop herself from asking. "What choice?" The same choice any of us hope we'd make, Thomas replied, his eyes fixed on the photograph. He made sure everyone else got clear. Made sure those kids in the school stayed safe. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, but this time Patricia barely noticed. She was too focused on the way Thomas's hands trembled as they held his son's photograph, the way his eyes seemed to see beyond the image to something else, something distant. "So, that's why you're going to Arlington," she said, her voice smaller now. To visit him. Thomas nodded slowly. "Section 60, he repeated. "That's where many of our recent heroes rest. Ryan's been there 5 years now, every birthday, every holiday. It's where I can still talk to him." Patricia felt something crack inside her chest, but her pride wouldn't let her acknowledge it fully. "And the medal?" she asked, gesturing toward his jacket. "The one you said wasn't yours." "Silver Star," Thomas said quietly. "They gave it to him posthumously, for his actions that day, for the lives he saved." The word posthumously seemed to echo in the small space between them. Patricia found herself staring at the outline of the medal beneath Thomas's jacket, seeing it with new eyes. It wasn't a bid for attention or a plea for special treatment. It was something else entirely. "You wear it to remember him," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. Thomas's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Patricia saw the full depth of emotion they contained. "I wear it to carry him with me," he corrected gently. "To keep his memory close. To remind myself of the price of freedom that so many people take for granted." Patricia turned away, unable to hold his gaze. Her earlier criticisms about veterans seeking attention, about living in the past, seemed hollow now, empty in the face of this father's quiet grief. "I didn't," she started, then stopped, unsure what she was trying to say. "I mean, I didn't know." "No, ma'am," Thomas agreed, quietly. "You didn't know. That's often the problem, isn't it? We see the uniform, the medals, the ceremonies. But we don't always see the stories behind them, given the families left behind, the empty chairs at dinner tables." The truth of his words hit Patricia like a physical force, but she wasn't ready to fully surrender her previous convictions. Not yet. She turned to look out the window, her mind struggling to reconcile what she had believed with what she was now learning. The flight attendant passed by again, offering them both water. This time, Patricia noticed how Thomas thanked her with genuine warmth, how his courtesy seemed to come from a place of real humanity rather than any desire for special treatment. An uncomfortable silence fell between Patricia and Thomas, broken only by the steady hum of the plane's engines. The revelation about his son had created a shift in the atmosphere, leaving Patricia struggling with emotions she wasn't prepared to face. She watched from the corner of her eye as Thomas carefully returned the photographs to his notebook, his movements deliberate and reverent. Each gesture seemed to carry a weight she hadn't noticed before, or perhaps hadn't wanted to notice. "Does it ever get easier?" she found herself asking, then immediately regretted the question. It wasn't the kind of thing she wanted to know, wasn't the kind of vulnerability she wanted to show. Thomas took a long moment before responding, his hands folded carefully in his lap. "No," he said finally, his voice carrying years of carefully contained grief. "But we learn to carry it better. We learn to honor their memory by living the life they can't." Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her earlier certainties about veterans and their supposed attention-seeking behavior were beginning to crumble, but her pride wouldn't let her admit it yet. "But all these ceremonies," she persisted, though her voice had lost its earlier edge. "All these memorials and special treatments." They're not for us," Thomas interrupted gently. "Not really. They're for them. For the ones who never came home. For the empty chairs at Christmas dinner and the birthdays never celebrated." The plane hit another patch of turbulence. and Patricia noticed how Thomas's hand moved automatically to touch the metal beneath his jacket. The gesture seemed different now, less like a bid for attention, and more like a father reaching for a connection to his lost son. "Ryan," she said quietly, testing the name. "You said he wanted to be a teacher." Thomas nodded, a small smile touching his weathered features. "4th grade. He loved kids, had a way with them. Even in Afghanistan, he'd spend his free time teaching English to the local children." Patricia felt something twist in her chest. Her own daughter was a 4th grade teacher, a fact that suddenly seemed to carry new significance. Did he get to teach at all? "Not in a classroom," Thomas replied, his eyes distant. "But his unit. They said he was always teaching something. Baseball rules, American history, even tried to start a book club on the base." He paused, his smile turning bittersweet. He had so many plans. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken loss. Patricia found herself thinking about all the harsh things she'd said earlier about veterans living in the past, about their need to remember and commemorate. A baby started crying a few rows ahead, and this time, when Thomas's hands tightened slightly on the armrests, Patricia saw it differently. Not as weakness or drama, but as the natural response of a man who had seen too much, lost too much. "The tremor," she said suddenly, gesturing toward his hands. "Is it?" "Parkinson's," Thomas answered quietly. "Started about 2 years after Ryan. If sinterefer broweek aikoro. Zalost. My Sally's eye and doctors say stress can accelerate it, but it's okay. Gives me something else to focus on sometimes." Patricia watched as he carefully adjusted his jacket, making sure the metal lay flat against his chest. She noticed how his fingers lingered over it like a father touching his child's cheek. "Section 60, she said, remembering his earlier words. "You said that's where he is?" Thomas nodded. "Among friends," he said softly. "Too many friends. Too many sons and daughters. Too many empty chairs." The phrase empty chairs echoed in Patricia's mind, making her think about all the times she'd complained about veterans getting special treatment, about all the times she'd rolled her eyes at memorial services and military honors. "You do this every year?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Visit him on his birthday?" "Every year," Thomas confirmed. "And Christmas, and Memorial Day, and sometimes just because the silence at home gets too loud." He paused, his hands folding and unfolding in his lap. "Sometimes I bring him baseball scores. Sometimes I just sit and tell him about my day. Sometimes I just sit." Patricia felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously, ready to cry, wasn't ready to fully acknowledge the shift happening in her understanding. The flight attendant passed by again, and Patricia noticed how she smiled at Thomas, not with pity or exaggerated respect, but with simple human kindness. She thought about all the times she'd interpreted such gestures as special treatment, as unearned privilege. "Your son," she started, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "I mean, Ryan. He must have been very brave." Thomas's hand moved once more to the metal beneath his jacket. "He was just doing what he believed was right," he said quietly. "Like so many others. Like so many who never came home." Despite the growing understanding between them, Patricia felt a surge of defensiveness rise up inside her. Years of prejudice and preconceptions couldn't be erased by a single story, no matter how moving. "But still," she said, her voice taking on an edge again, though softer than before. "All these tributes, all these ceremonies, don't you think it's a bit excessive? I mean, other people lose loved ones too. Other people make sacrifices." Thomas's expression remained gentle, but something flickered in his eyes. Yes, they do, he agreed quietly. Loss is universal, but not all losses come from conscious choices to put others first. What's that supposed to mean? Patricia asked, her defenses rising again. Are you saying military deaths are somehow more significant than civilian ones? More worthy of remembrance? She watched as Thomas carefully adjusted his jacket, making sure the metal lay flat. No, ma'am, he replied. Every loss is significant. Every empty chair matters. But there's a difference between dying for something and dying from something. That sounds like military propaganda, Patricia shot back, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Making it all sound noble and purposeful when really it's just tragedy like any other. Thomas pulled out his notebook again, this time removing what looked like a letter. This was the last thing Ryan wrote to me, he said, his hands trembling slightly as he held the worn paper. He knew the risks of that final mission. He chose to go anyway. Because he was ordered to, Patricia interjected. That's not really a choice. No, ma'am. Thomas shook his head. He volunteered. They all did. They knew about the IED threat in that area, knew the risks of clearing it, but they also knew about the school nearby, about the children who walked that road every day. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. But that's what I mean about the glorification, she persisted. You're making it sound like some kind of movie scene. Real life isn't that dramatic. You're right, Thomas agreed, surprising her. Real life isn't dramatic. Real life is a young man writing his last letter home. Real life is a father learning to live with an empty chair at his dinner table. Real life is visiting a grave on birthdays and holidays, trying to keep memories alive. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, and Patricia noticed how Thomas's hand moved instinctively to touch the metal again. The gesture seemed different now, less like a bid for attention and more like a father reaching for a connection to his lost son. But what about other sacrifices? She asked, her voice smaller now. What about people who lose children to illness or accidents? So, every loss is tragic, Thomas said gently. Every parent's grief is sacred. But Ryan, and others like him, they wrote their own endings. They chose to put themselves between danger and others. That's not better or worse than other losses. It's just different. Patricia felt tears threatening again but fought them back. And the special treatment? The constant thank yous and tributes? Those aren't for us, Thomas repeated, his voice heavy with emotion. They're not even really for Ryan anymore. They're for the ones who might have to make the same choice tomorrow. They're for the families who will face their own empty chairs. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Patricia thought about all the times she'd complained about veterans' benefits, about military discounts and priority boarding. She thought about her own daughter, safe in her fourth-grade classroom, teaching children who would never know the cost of that safety. The medal, she said finally, gesturing toward Thomas's chest. Do you wear it every day? Thomas touched the medal gently through his jacket. Only on special days, he replied. Birthdays, holidays, days when the silence gets too loud and I need to feel him close. Patricia watched as he carefully straightened his jacket again, the tremor in his hands more pronounced now. She thought about all her earlier comments about veterans seeking attention, about living in the past, about needing to move on. I still think, she started, then paused, choosing her words more carefully. Hard for civilians to understand sometimes, all the ceremonies, all the tributes. It can seem overwhelming. Thomas nodded slowly. Understanding isn't required, he said quietly. Just respect. Not for me, not even for Ryan anymore. But for the choice they made, for the empty chairs they left behind. The plane began its initial descent into Washington, the captain's voice crackling over the intercom with landing announcements. Patricia found herself watching Thomas's reaction to every bump and movement, seeing his responses through new eyes. "Will someone," she began hesitantly, "will someone meet you at the airport? For your visit to Section 60? Thomas shook his head slowly, his hand steady on the armrests despite their persistent tremor. "No," he replied quietly. "Ryan's mother passed 2 years ago. Cancer. His sister lives in California now, has her own family to tend to. Some days it's just me and him." Patricia felt something twist in her chest. The image of this elderly veteran making his solitary journey to his son's grave on what should have been a birthday celebration struck her in a way she hadn't expected. "What about your unit?" she asked, remembering all her earlier comments about veterans and their constant reunions. Don't they visit?" "Some do when they can," Thomas replied, adjusting his jacket again. "Many have their own battles now. PTSD, health issues, families to support. Life moves on, even when sometimes we wish it wouldn't." The plane banked slightly, and Patricia noticed how Thomas's hand moved automatically to touch the metal beneath his jacket. The gesture seemed almost unconscious now, like a father reaching for his child's hand. "Earlier," she said, her voice softer than before, "when you mentioned the tremors, you said they started after Ryan's." She couldn't finish the sentence. Thomas nodded, his weathered features showing a hint of the pain he usually kept hidden. The doctors call it stress-induced Parkinson's. The body keeps score, they say. Keeps track of the grief we try to ignore. Patricia thought about all her previous comments about veterans and their medical conditions, about her accusations of them seeking attention and special treatment. The shame rose in her throat like bile. "Is that why you were in the military hospital?" she asked, remembering the medical papers she'd glimpsed earlier. "For the Parkinson's?" "Partly," Thomas replied, his hands folded carefully in his lap. "But mostly for the heart. Turns out grief can affect that too. They wanted to keep me longer, but..." He glanced at his watch. "Some appointments can't be missed." The plane descended through a layer of clouds, the cabin lights flickering briefly. Patricia watched as Thomas pulled out his notebook one more time, his trembling fingers carefully arranging the photographs and papers inside. "You haven't told me," she said suddenly, "what you talk about when you visit him, I mean." A small smile touched Thomas's lips, gentle and sad. "Baseball scores, mostly. The Yankees are having a good season. He would have loved that. Sometimes I tell him about his nieces and nephews, though I've mostly only seen them in pictures. Sometimes..." He paused, his voice growing softer. "Sometimes I just sit there and remember how his laugh used to fill up a room." Patricia felt tears threatening again, but this time she didn't fight them as hard. "And the medal?" she asked. Do you tell him about that?" Thomas's hand moved to his chest again, touching the silver star that lay hidden beneath his jacket. "No," he said quietly. He never cared much for medals or recognition. He just cared about doing what was right. The plane's landing gear deployed with a mechanical whine, and Patricia noticed how Thomas's grip tightened slightly on the armrests. She thought about all her earlier mockery of veterans' reactions to loud noises and sudden movements. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, the words coming out before she could stop them. About everything I said. About how I acted." Thomas turned to look at her, his eyes carrying a gentle understanding that made her feel even worse. "We all have our prejudices, ma'am. The important thing is recognizing them when they're wrong." The plane was making its final approach now, the ground growing closer through the windows. Patricia watched as Thomas carefully buttoned his jacket, making sure the metal lay flat against his chest close to his heart. "Will you..." She hesitated, then continued. "Will you tell him something from me? When you visit him today?" Thomas looked at her questioningly, waiting for her to continue. Tell him. She swallowed hard. Tell him thank you. For the choice he made. For the children he saved. For... She gestured vaguely at the world outside the plane window. For all of this, slowly, his eyes showing a depth of emotion that made Patricia look away. I'll tell him, he said quietly. Though I think he already knows. They all do. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, and Patricia noticed how Thomas's hand moved once more to touch the metal. She thought about all her earlier comments about veterans being dramatic, about them seeking attention with their uniforms and medals. Now she understood. It wasn't about attention at all. It was about connection, about holding on to something precious that had been lost. When you get to Section 60, she said hesitantly, do other families? Are there others who... Every day, Thomas replied, understanding her unfinished question. Mothers, fathers, wives, children, each with their own stories, their own empty chairs. We nod to each other, share silent understanding. Some bring flowers, some bring letters, some just bring their memories. The plane taxied to the gate, and Patricia watched as Thomas began gathering his things with careful, methodical movements. Each item went into his bag with deliberate precision, the notebook with its precious photographs, the worn letter from Ryan, a small American flag she hadn't noticed before. The jacket, she said suddenly. The one I criticized you for wearing. It's not about showing off, is it? Thomas smoothed down the front of his jacket, his fingers lingering over the hidden metal. No, ma'am. Sometimes it's just about feeling closer to them, about carrying their memory with honor. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began standing, gathering their belongings. Patricia noticed how several people glanced at Thomas with respect now, having overheard parts of their conversation. She thought about how differently she'd interpreted those same looks just hours ago. Mr. Henderson, she said, using his name for the first time. I know it doesn't mean much now, but I truly am sorry. Not just for what I said, but for what I thought. For all the assumptions I made. Thomas stood carefully, his movements measured and deliberate. We all make assumptions, ma'am. The important thing is being willing to learn when we're wrong. Ryan taught me that, among many other things. As they prepared to leave the plane, Patricia found herself wanting to say more, to somehow make up for her earlier behavior. But what could she say to a father heading to visit his son's grave on what should have been a birthday celebration? The empty chair, she said finally, remembering his words from earlier. It never really gets filled, does it? Thomas paused in the aisle, his hand resting on the seat in front of him. No, he replied softly. But sometimes, if we're lucky, we learn to see it differently. Not just as a space that's empty, but as a reminder of why it's empty, of the choice they made, of the lives they saved. The truth of his words settled over Patricia like a weight, making her see everything. The jacket, the metal, the trembling hands, the quiet dignity, in a completely new light. That evening, in her hotel room, Patricia couldn't shake the weight of her encounter with Thomas Henderson. She sat on the edge of her bed, her laptop open but forgotten, her mind replaying every cruel word she'd spoken on that flight. The room felt suffocating despite its luxury. She'd chosen one of Washington's finest hotels, the kind of place that usually made her feel important, successful. Now the plush surroundings seemed to mock her, highlighting the contrast between her material comfort and Thomas's solitary journey to Section 60. She found herself wondering if he was still there, sitting beside his son's grave, sharing baseball scores and family news with a marble headstone. The image made her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Patricia pulled out her phone, opening her browser. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before typing. Section 60, Arlington Cemetery. The search results loaded instantly, filling her screen with images that made her breath catch. Rows upon rows of white headstones perfectly aligned stretching into the distance, fresh flowers laying against marble, small American flags fluttering in the breeze, and people, so many people, kneeling, sitting, standing beside the graves. Parents, spouses, children, all carrying their own versions of empty chairs. She clicked on an article about Section 60, reading about how it had become known as the saddest acre in America. It was where the military buried its most recent fallen, the ones from Iraq and Afghanistan. Ryan's generation, the ones who, as she had so callously put it, didn't see real combat. Patricia felt bile rise in her throat as she remembered her words. She clicked on another link, this one about a Silver Star recipient who had sacrificed himself to save his unit and nearby civilians. It was different from Ryan's, but the essence was the same. A conscious choice to put others first, to step into danger rather than away from it. Her phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from her daughter, responding to her earlier message about being in Washington. "Mom, since you're there, you should visit Arlington. It's beautiful this time of year." The innocuous suggestion hit Patricia like a physical blow. Her daughter, the fourth-grade teacher, the same profession Ryan had dreamed of. How many of her students' parents had served? How many of them had their own stories of loss and sacrifice? She opened her suitcase, pulling out her carefully pressed business suit for tomorrow's meeting. The expensive fabric felt meaningless now. The status it represented hollow compared to Thomas's worn military jacket and the medal he carried close to his heart. Patricia walked to the window, looking out over the Washington skyline. Somewhere out there, in Section 60, a father was probably just leaving his son's grave, carrying a weight she had dismissed and mocked just hours ago. Her reflection in the window caught her eye, and she barely recognized herself. Was this what she had become? Someone so wrapped up in her own importance that she could mock a grieving father? Someone so blinded by prejudice that she could dismiss the sacrifice of a young man who had given his life for others? She thought about Thomas's trembling hands, about how she had interpreted them as a bid for attention rather than the physical manifestation of a parent's grief. She thought about his quiet dignity in the face of her cruelty, about how he had responded to her hatred with understanding. The room's telephone rang, startling her. It was the front desk, confirming her wake-up call for tomorrow's meeting. Patricia thanked them automatically, but the corporate world she had been so proud of suddenly seemed distant and unimportant. She returned to her laptop, opening a new tab. Without fully understanding why, she found herself searching for information about veteran support organizations, about programs that helped military families, about ways to honor those who had given everything. The Silver Star citation caught her eye. Another link, another story. She clicked on it, reading about the criteria for the award. Gallantry in action, distinguished and exceptional valor, extraordinary heroism. Words she had dismissed as military propaganda just hours ago now carried the weight of real sacrifice, real choice, real consequence. Her phone buzzed again. Another email, this time from her office. Something about tomorrow's presentation, about quarterly reports and market projections. Patricia stared at it, seeing for the first time how much of her identity had been wrapped up in these things, how she had used her corporate success to justify looking down on others. The night settled around her as she sat there, surrounded by the trappings of her success, but feeling more lost than ever. Outside her window, the capital city continued its endless rhythm, unaware of the profound shift happening in one woman's understanding of sacrifice, service, and the true cost of freedom. The next morning, Patricia sat in her hotel room's small business center, her coffee growing cold beside her untouched laptop. Her meeting wasn't for several hours, and she found herself drawn to the computer for a different purpose entirely. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, typing Silver Star Recipients Afghanistan into the search bar. The results loaded quickly, filling her screen with stories of valor and sacrifice. She scrolled through them, her heart growing heavier with each account, until a familiar name caught her eye. Marine Sergeant Ryan Henderson, awarded Silver Star, posthumously. Patricia's hand trembled as she clicked the link. The article opened to show a photograph she recognized. The same young man from Thomas's worn picture, but in full dress uniform, his smile bright and confident. The date on the article was 5 years ago. Marine Sergeant Ryan Henderson, 26, was posthumously awarded the Silver Star for extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in action, the article began. Patricia felt her throat tighten as she read on. While leading a convoy through a known high-threat area, Sergeant Henderson identified an IED placed near a local elementary school. With complete disregard for his own safety, he ensured his unit and nearby civilians were cleared from the area before attempting to disable the device. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She thought about her cruel comments on the plane, about veterans seeking attention and playing up their service. The article continued, describing how Ryan's actions had saved not only his entire unit, but also prevented casualties among the local school children who used that road daily. Ryan's commanding officer jumped out at her. Sergeant Henderson embodied the highest traditions of the Marine Corps. He was not only a skilled warrior, but also a compassionate leader who spent his free time teaching English to local children and organizing sports activities for his unit. His final act of heroism was entirely in keeping with his character. Patricia clicked through to related articles, each one revealing more about the young man whose father she had treated so cruelly. She found pictures of Ryan with local Afghan children, teaching them to play baseball. Another showed him helping to build a school playground. In every image, his face showed the same quiet dignity she had seen in his father. Then she found the memorial page. It was filled with comments from fellow Marines, local Afghan families, and people whose lives Ryan had touched. One comment in particular made her hands shake. "I was one of the teachers at the school near where Sergeant Henderson made his final sacrifice. Because of his actions, 37 children arrived safely at school that day, and hundreds more continue to walk that road safely. He gave his life not just for his fellow Marines, but for our children's future." Patricia thought about her own daughter teaching 4th grade, about the children who sat safely in her classroom. How many other soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines had made similar sacrifices to ensure that safety? She found another article about the award ceremony. Thomas was there, looking younger but already carrying that profound sadness in his eyes, accepting the Silver Star on behalf of his son. The photo showed him holding the medal with trembling hands, the same tremor she had mocked just yesterday. The article mentioned Ryan's plans to become a teacher after his service, his work with local children in Afghanistan, his belief in education as a path to peace. Patricia thought about all her dismissive comments about veterans living in the past, about her accusations of them seeking attention and special treatment. A video clip caught her attention, footage from the ceremony. She clicked play, watching as Thomas stood straight and proud despite his grief, listening to the citation being read. The camera panned to show Ryan's mother, still alive then, clutching a folded flag to her chest. In his final letter home, the speaker in the video said, Sergeant Henderson wrote about the children he had been teaching. He said, "Dad, these kids are the future. Every one of them who chooses a book over a bomb is a victory. That's worth any sacrifice." Patricia closed the browser quickly, unable to watch more. She thought about Thomas, probably already at Arlington today, sitting beside his son's grave on what should have been his birthday. She thought about the medal he wore beneath his jacket, not as a bid for attention, but as a father's way of keeping his son close to his heart. The shame was overwhelming now, but with it came something else, a desperate need to make amends, to somehow acknowledge the magnitude of her error. Her eyes fell on her meeting schedule for the day. The corporate world that had seemed so important yesterday now felt trivial compared to the weight of what she had discovered. She pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the keypad. There had to be something she could do, some way to acknowledge the true meaning of sacrifice she had so callously dismissed. The reality of her discoveries hit Patricia with full force as she sat in her hotel room, her business meeting completely forgotten. Her hands shook as she picked up her phone again, scrolling through the articles she had just read about Ryan Henderson. The weight of her behavior on the flight seemed unbearable now. Each cruel word she had spoken to Thomas echoed in her mind, amplified by the knowledge of what he had truly lost, what his son had sacrificed, and why he wore that medal so close to his heart. Real combat, she had sneered at him. The words made her physically ill now. She thought about Ryan, just 26 years old, making that final choice to ensure others' safety. She thought about Thomas, carrying not just grief, but also pride. A father's pride in a son who had lived and died by his principles. Patricia opened her laptop again, unable to stop herself from learning more. She found an interview with one of Ryan's fellow Marines, describing how he had organized English classes for local children during his off-duty hours. The article included a photo of Ryan sitting cross-legged on the ground, surrounded by smiling Afghan children, teaching them to write their names in English. He always said education was the best weapon against hatred, his fellow Marine had commented. Said he couldn't wait to have his own classroom back home. Came freely now as Patricia remembered her mocking words about veterans seeking attention, about them needing to move on and live in the present. She thought about Thomas, making his solitary journey to Section 60 year after year, carrying his son's medal close to his heart. She found herself reading about Parkinson's disease, about how severe emotional trauma could trigger its onset. The tremor in Thomas's hands that she had so cruelly dismissed as attention-seeking now revealed itself as the physical manifestation of a father's grief. Her phone buzzed with a message from her office, something about the upcoming meeting's presentation. Patricia stared at it, seeing for the first time how shallow her priorities had been. She had been so proud of her corporate success, so quick to judge others based on her narrow definition of contribution to society. She thought about Thomas's words regarding the empty chair at his dinner table, about how some days the silence got too loud. She thought about how she had scoffed at veterans' benefits and special treatments, never once considering the true cost of the freedoms she enjoyed. The image of Ryan's last letter to his father haunted her. "These kids are the future," he had written. "Every one of them who chooses a book over a bomb is a victory." Patricia thought about her own daughter teaching 4th grade, about the safety and security her students took for granted, security bought with sacrifices like Ryan's. She found more photos from the Silver Star ceremony. There was Thomas, younger, but already carrying that profound sadness in his eyes, accepting the medal that he now wore beneath his jacket. There was Ryan's mother, now passed away, clutching the folded flag. There were Ryan's fellow Marines, standing at attention, honoring their fallen brother. Patricia thought about how she had mocked Thomas for checking his watch during the flight, how she had assumed he was rushing to some attention-seeking ceremony. Now she understood. He had been counting the minutes until he could be close to his son again, even if only beside a marble headstone in Section 60. Her hands trembled as she reached for her purse, pulling out her business cards. The title she had been so proud of, Senior Vice President Corporate Strategy, seemed meaningless now. What strategy could justify the cruelty she had shown to a grieving father? What corporate success could compare to the sacrifice of a young man who gave his life for others? The morning sun streamed through her hotel window, illuminating the capital city beyond. Somewhere out there, in Section 60, Thomas was probably already sitting beside his son's grave, sharing baseball scores and family news, carrying the weight of loss and pride that she had so callously dismissed. Patricia stood up abruptly, walking to the window. She watched as people hurried along the streets below, going about their daily lives, enjoying freedoms they took for granted, freedoms protected by people like Ryan Henderson and countless others who had made the ultimate sacrifice. The magnitude of her error, of her prejudice and cruelty, seemed overwhelming now. But with that recognition came something else, a desperate need to make amends, to somehow acknowledge the true meaning of service and sacrifice she had so willfully misunderstood. Patricia's fingers hovered over her phone's keyboard as she struggled to find the right words. How does one apologize for such profound misjudgment? How could she possibly express the depth of her regret for the cruel words she had spoken to a grieving father? After several attempts, she began typing. Mr. Henderson, I know no apology can erase the hurt I caused with my ignorant and cruel words on our flight yesterday. Learning about Ryan, about his sacrifice and the lives he saved, has opened my eyes to a truth I was too blind to see. I am deeply, profoundly sorry. She paused, tears blurring her vision, then continued. I read about Ryan's Silver Star, about his work with the children in Afghanistan, about his dreams of becoming a teacher. I read about how he sacrificed himself to save his unit and those school children. The medal you wear isn't about attention or special treatment. It's about keeping your son's memory and sacrifice alive. Patricia stopped again, remembering Thomas's trembling hands and quiet dignity in the face of her cruelty. She added, I also learned about how grief can trigger Parkinson's disease. I am ashamed of how I mocked your tremors, how I dismissed them as attention-seeking. You bore my cruel words with such grace, even as I ridiculed the physical manifestation of your loss. Before she could second-guess herself, she found the contact information for the Marine Corps Association and made a substantial donation in Ryan's name. She included this information in her message. I've made a donation to help support Marine families and educational programs. Doesn't begin to make up for my behavior, but I hope it might help other young Marines who share Ryan's belief in education as a path to peace. Still feeling the inadequacy of her efforts, Patricia opened her laptop again and searched for organizations supporting veterans with Parkinson's disease. She found several and made donations to each one, dedicating them to Thomas Henderson, a father who carried his son's medal close to his heart. She then did something she had never done before. She called her office and canceled her meetings for the day. When her assistant expressed surprise, Patricia simply said, "Something more important has come up. Something I need to make right." Opening her browser again, she searched for information about visiting Arlington. The cemetery's website provided details about Section 60, about proper etiquette and protocols. She read everything carefully, wanting to ensure she wouldn't compound her errors with inappropriate behavior. Patricia changed out of her business suit into more modest attire, something more appropriate for visiting a sacred place. As she gathered her things, her phone buzzed with another work email, something about quarterly projections and market analysis. She ignored it. Instead, she found herself writing another message to Thomas. I don't know if you'll want to hear from me again, and I would understand if you don't. But I want you to know that your son's story, his sacrifice, and your quiet dignity in carrying his memory have changed something fundamental in me. I will never again look at a veteran or a military family without understanding the true weight of their service and sacrifice. She paused, then added, Ryan's dream of becoming a teacher, of believing in education as a path to peace, particularly moved me. My own daughter teaches 4th grade, the same grade Ryan hoped to teach. I've never fully appreciated the safety and security her students enjoy, or the sacrifices that ensure that security. Before leaving her hotel room, Patricia made one final gesture. She found an organization that supported educational initiatives in Afghanistan, particularly focusing on schools in areas where U.S. service members had helped build and protect learning environments. She made a significant donation in Ryan Henderson's name, adding a note about his belief in education as a weapon against hatred. As she gathered her purse and keys, Patricia caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman who had boarded that plane yesterday, so full of prejudice and self-importance, seemed like a stranger now. The truth about Thomas, about Ryan, about sacrifice and service, had stripped away her comfortable illusions, leaving her face to face with the reality of her own ignorance and cruelty. She pulled out her phone one more time, adding to her message to Thomas. I read about the teacher at the school near where Ryan made his final sacrifice, about how 37 children arrived safely at school that day because of his choice. I read about how hundreds more continue to walk that road safely. As an educator's mother, I now understand the true value of such sacrifice. Patricia sat on the edge of her hotel bed, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had learned. She thought about all the times she had complained about veterans receiving special treatment, about how she had mocked their ceremonies and memorials. Now she understood. These weren't about seeking attention or special privileges. They were about honoring choices made and lives given in service to others. She found herself writing one more addition to her message. Mr. Henderson, I know you're at Section 60 today, sharing baseball scores with Ryan and carrying his medal close to your heart. I want you to know that his story, his sacrifice, and your dignity in carrying his memory will stay with me forever. I will share his story with my daughter's students, helping them understand the true cost of the freedom they enjoy. Before leaving, Patricia made one final search for organizations supporting Gold Star families. She found several and made donations to each, adding notes about how her interaction with Thomas Henderson had opened her eyes to the ongoing cost of service and sacrifice. She thought about Thomas's words regarding the empty chair at his dinner table, about how some days the silence got too loud. She added one last note to her message. I understand now what you meant about the empty chairs, about how they're not just spaces that are empty, but reminders of why they're empty, of the choices made, of the lives saved. As she prepared to leave for Arlington, Patricia realized that no amount of donations or apologies could fully make up for her behavior. But perhaps by carrying this new understanding forward, by sharing Ryan's story and honoring his sacrifice, she could begin to make amends for her ignorance and cruelty. Still early enough to visit Arlington before it closed. The woman who had been so focused on corporate meetings and business success now had only one priority: paying proper respect to a young Marine who had given everything for others, and to the father who carried his memory with such quiet dignity. 2 days after sending her messages, Patricia received a response from Thomas Henderson. She was back in her office, trying to focus on work, but finding her thoughts constantly drifting to Section 60 and the profound lessons she had learned. Her hands trembled as she opened the email, much like Thomas's had on the plane, though for entirely different reasons. The message was simple but powerful. Dear Ms. Morgan, thank you for your messages and your generosity. Ryan would have appreciated your support of education initiatives. He always believed that knowledge was the best defense against hatred. Your visit to Section 60 meant a lot. The groundskeeper told me about the flowers you left and about how long you stayed. He said you sat there for nearly 2 hours. Patricia remembered those hours clearly. She had found Ryan's grave marker easily enough. The groundskeeper had helped her locate it. She had stood there for a long time, reading the inscription over and over, trying to fully comprehend the sacrifice it represented. Thomas's email continued. I want you to know that I accept your apology. We all have moments that change us, that force us to see the world differently. Ryan taught me that. He was always looking for the teaching moment in every situation, even the difficult ones. Patricia felt tears forming as she read on. The Yankees won yesterday. I told Ryan about it. I also told him about you, about how people can change when they open their hearts to understanding. He would have appreciated that. He always believed in second chances. The email included a photograph, a young Ryan in his baseball uniform, years before he joined the Marines. He was grinning at the camera, his whole life ahead of him. Thomas had added a caption, Ryan's last high school game. He pitched a no-hitter that day, said it was good practice for teaching. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the most important ones. Patricia found herself responding immediately. Mr. Henderson, I don't deserve your kindness or forgiveness, but I am deeply grateful for both. Your son's story, his dedication to education and peace, has become part of my life now. I've shared it with my daughter's 4th grade class. With your permission, of course, they were profoundly moved, especially when they learned he had wanted to be a teacher like them. She paused, then added, The groundskeeper also told me about the baseball you leave at his grave marker sometimes. He said many visitors have noticed it, and it's become something of a tradition for people to touch it for luck, like a reminder that love continues even after loss. Thomas's reply came quickly. The baseball tradition started by accident. I left one of his old high school balls there one day, and when I came back the next week, I found notes from other families tucked under it. Messages about how their loved ones had also loved baseball, had also dreamed of teaching, had also believed in making a difference. Now I leave a fresh ball every month. Patricia read about how visitors to Section 60 had begun leaving their own small tributes alongside the baseball. Notes, medals, photos, each telling its own story of sacrifice and remembrance. The simple game ball had become a symbol of connection, of shared loss and understanding. Your donations to the education initiatives, Thomas wrote, have already made a difference. The school in Afghanistan where Ryan used to teach has received new supplies, and they're starting a baseball program in his memory. The children there may never know him, but they'll benefit from his legacy of believing in education as a path to peace. He attached another photo, this one showing Afghan children on a makeshift baseball field, using equipment provided by one of the organizations Patricia had donated to. The image brought fresh tears to her eyes as she thought about Ryan's final letter home, about his belief that every child who chose a book over a bomb was a victory. Thomas's email concluded with words that would stay with Patricia forever. The medal I wear isn't just for Ryan's final act of heroism. It's for every moment he chose to serve others, every time he put others' needs before his own. When you understood that, when you visited his grave and sat with his memory, you honored not just him, but all those who have left empty chairs at dinner tables across our nation. Thank you for that. Patricia found herself reading Thomas's final words repeatedly, each time understanding them more deeply. She opened her laptop and typed a response. Mr. Henderson, your words about the baseball tradition touched me deeply, with some local schools about starting a program in Ryan's memory, teaching children about service, sacrifice, and the importance of education. Several teachers have already expressed interest in participating. She went on to describe how her daughter's fourth-grade class had been particularly moved by Ryan's story. They had started a project called Heroes Among Us, exploring stories of people who had chosen to put others first. Ryan's story of protecting the Afghan school had become a centerpiece of their discussions. The children asked if they could write letters to you, Patricia wrote. They want to know more about Ryan, about his dreams of teaching, about the children he helped in Afghanistan. If you're willing, they would be honored to learn from his story. Thomas's response came later that evening. Ryan would have loved that. He always said that children have an amazing capacity for understanding complex truths when we give them the chance. I would be honored to share more of his story with them. Patricia found herself crying again as she read about how Thomas had begun collecting stories from other families in Section 60, about how the baseball tradition had spread to other sections of Arlington. Visitors now left baseballs at graves throughout the cemetery, each one carrying messages of love, remembrance, and connection. The groundskeeper told me something else, Thomas wrote. He said that after you left Ryan's grave, you walked through Section 60, reading other names, leaving flowers at markers that looked unvisited. He said you took the time to acknowledge each sacrifice, to understand that every headstone represents an empty chair somewhere. Patricia remembered that walk clearly, how each name had seemed to carry new weight after understanding Ryan's story. She had found herself reading them aloud softly, wondering about their dreams, their sacrifices, their families left behind. Your understanding, Thomas concluded, your willingness to learn and change, that's what Ryan fought for. The freedom to grow, to learn, to become better versions of ourselves. Every time you share his story, every time you help others understand the true meaning of service and sacrifice, you honor not just his memory, but his beliefs about what makes our nation great. The email ended with a photo of sunrise over Section 60, the morning light catching the dew on Ryan's baseball, surrounded by notes and tokens left by visitors who had been touched by his story. It was a powerful reminder that even in loss, hope and connection could flourish. Patricia saved the photo, knowing it would serve as a constant reminder of the lessons she had learned about judgment, understanding, and the true meaning of service and sacrifice. In the months that followed her exchange with Thomas, Patricia's life underwent a profound transformation. The corporate executive who had once mocked military service and dismissed veteran sacrifices became an active advocate for military families and their causes. She started with her own company, completely revamping their veterans hiring program. No longer was it just a mandatory diversity initiative, as she had once dismissively called it. Instead, she created a comprehensive support system that understood and valued the unique experiences and skills veterans brought to the workplace. Look at their resumes differently, she told her HR team during a training session. When you see gaps for deployments, don't think of lost time. Think of leadership under pressure. When you see military service, don't just think of combat. Think of logistics, planning, team building, and sacrifice. The tremor in Thomas's hands had taught her another valuable lesson. She implemented new health support systems, ensuring that veterans dealing with physical or emotional challenges had the resources and understanding they needed. No longer did anyone in her company need to hide their struggles or feel ashamed of seeking help. Patricia's daughter's fourth-grade class became a hub for a new educational initiative. Working with Thomas, they developed a program called Empty Chairs, teaching children about service, sacrifice, and the importance of looking beyond surface judgments. Every empty chair has a story, she told a group of students during one presentation. Every uniform represents choices made, sacrifices offered, families left behind. When you see a veteran, you're not just seeing one person, you're seeing all the lives they've touched, all the decisions they've made to put others first. The baseball tradition from Section 60 inspired her to create a new memorial project. Working with local schools and veterans organizations, they began collecting baseballs signed with messages of gratitude and understanding. These balls would be displayed at various veterans memorials, each one carrying stories and connections. Patricia received an email from a Marine who had served with Ryan. He had heard about her transformation through Thomas and wanted to share something with her. Attached was a photo of Ryan teaching Afghan children how to play baseball using a makeshift field behind their school. This was 2 days before we lost him, the Marine wrote. He had just finished teaching an English class, but the kids wanted to learn baseball too. Ryan always said that games could bridge cultures better than words sometimes. He believed that every moment was a chance to teach something valuable. Patricia shared this photo with her corporate board while proposing a new initiative, a scholarship program for veterans who wanted to become teachers. Ryan Henderson believed that education was the strongest weapon against hatred, she told them. Let's honor that belief by helping others follow in his footsteps. The program was approved unanimously. Within months, they had their first class of veteran scholars, each one committed to bringing their experiences and understanding into classrooms across the country. Thomas became a regular speaker at these scholarship ceremonies. Despite his trembling hands, he would pin a small baseball pin on each recipient's lapel. Ryan's legacy lives on through you, he would tell them. Every student you teach, every life you touch, carries forward his belief in education as a path to peace. Patricia also organized regular visits to Section 60, bringing corporate leaders and decision-makers to understand the true cost of service. They would walk among the headstones, read the names, and learn about the stories behind each one. Remember, when you see a veteran, she would tell them, you're not just seeing an individual. You're seeing someone who made choices, who put others first, who left behind empty chairs so that others could sit safely in theirs. The tremor in Thomas's hands had grown worse over time, but he never complained. Instead, he used it as a teaching moment. Sometimes, he told Patricia's daughter's class, our bodies remember what our hearts can never forget. But that's not weakness. It's a reminder of the depth of human love and sacrifice. Patricia's own transformation became a story she shared freely, using her past prejudice and ignorance as a lesson in the importance of understanding and growth. I was wrong, she would say in her presentations. I saw uniforms and medals as bids for attention, never understanding they were connections to sacrifices made and lives given. The baseball tradition spread to other military cemeteries across the country, each one becoming a point of connection and remembrance. Patricia made sure every ball carried a message about Ryan's belief in education and peace, ensuring his legacy continued to touch lives and open hearts. 1 year after their flight together, Patricia found herself back at Arlington National Cemetery. This time, she wasn't walking through Section 60 as a chastened visitor, but as someone who had been invited to attend a special ceremony. The scholarship program she had created in Ryan's memory was holding its first graduation ceremony. 5 veterans who had completed their teaching degrees would be receiving their certificates, ready to carry forward Ryan's dream of education as a path to peace. Thomas had suggested holding the ceremony near Ryan's grave, a proposal that the cemetery administrators had approved after learning about the program's significance. As Patricia approached Section 60, she saw Thomas standing there, his weathered military jacket still carrying Ryan's silver star beneath it. "Ms. Morgan," he greeted her, his voice warm despite the tremor in his hands as he reached out to shake hers. Ryan would have loved this, all these new teachers ready to make a difference. Patricia felt tears forming as she looked at the setup. 5 chairs for the graduates, positioned respectfully near Ryan's headstone. Each chair had a baseball on it, signed by students from the schools where these veterans would soon begin teaching. "Mr. Henderson," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I can never thank you enough for your forgiveness, for helping me understand what true service means." The graduates began arriving, each one stopping to shake Thomas's hand and touch Ryan's headstone. They had all learned his story, understood the legacy they were carrying forward. Each wore a small baseball pin on their graduation robes, a symbol of connection to Ryan's memory. "These past months," Patricia said softly as they watched the graduates take their places, "seeing how these veterans approached teaching, understanding their dedication to serving others. It's taught me so much more about what I failed to see before." Thomas nodded, his hand moving to touch the metal beneath his jacket. "Ryan always said that teaching was just another form of service. These men and women understand that." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.